I moved to this small American town just a couple of weeks ago. After the noisy and hectic metropolis where I had spent most of my life, this quiet neighborhood seemed like a real escape. My new home, a cozy two-story cottage with a magnificent view of the surrounding woods, was exactly what I dreamed of. I spent the first few days enjoying the peace and quiet that seemed to last forever here. Soon after moving in, however, I began to notice oddities about my neighbor. His house looked almost identical to mine, except that it was a bit neglected and always seemed to be immersed in semi-darkness. I didn't see my neighbor very often, and each encounter was brief and accompanied by awkwardness. The middle-aged man, always dressed in dark-colored clothes, avoided my gaze and seemed to try to end any attempt at conversation as quickly as possible. At first, I tried to ignore my initial sense of unease, writing it off as the stress of the move and my own prejudices. But the weirdness didn't stop. My neighbor would only leave the house at night, and strange noises would come from his house at the most unexpected times. I tried to convince myself that these were just manifestations of the ordinary life of a man I knew nothing about. But the doubts kept piling up. One evening, I decided to get to know my neighbor better, hoping to dispel my doubts and perhaps become friends. I made a pie, and after gathering my courage, I headed to his house. Knocking on the door, I got no answer. Standing on the threshold, I felt the air around me grow colder, and the house in front of me seemed even more gloomy and uninviting than usual. Deciding that the attempt had failed, I returned home, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. Those first days in my new home marked the beginning of a series of events that would forever change my life and my perception of what was considered normal in this quiet American town. After that unfortunate evening of trying to strike up a conversation with my neighbor, my curiosity only intensified. I began to notice more and more oddities that I couldn't explain logically. It was more than just social awkwardness or introversion. His behavior seemed like a mystery that I felt the need to solve. Nights became the time of my secret observations. I noticed that my neighbor regularly left the house in the middle of the night. His gait seemed purposeful, but where he was going remained a mystery to me. He always returned before dawn, slipping stealthily back into his house. What could he be doing during those hours? In a city where life came to a standstill as darkness fell, his nocturnal walks looked especially suspicious. In addition, strange noises had become a regular occurrence. Sometimes at night, I heard low, faint sounds coming from his house. It was not like the usual sounds of a residential house. It was a kind of groaning or scraping, as if someone was dragging heavy objects across the floor. I tried to find a logical explanation, but my guesses were inconclusive. Another detail that confused me was his avoidance of contact. If I happened to leave the house at the same time as him, my neighbor would immediately hide his eyes and quicken his steps, as if he was afraid of meeting me. One day, when I decided to try my luck again and talk to him, he simply ignored my greeting and left without a word. These observations made me think that perhaps there was something more serious behind my neighbor's behavior than I could have imagined. I began to ask myself questions. What if he was doing something illegal? Or what if my suspicions were unfounded and I was just a victim of my own imagination? The nights became increasingly sleepless as my desire to uncover my neighbor's secret grew each day. I felt I had to do something to find out who he was and what he was hiding behind the walls of his house. But how far was I willing to go in my investigations? That question remained open. With each sleepless night spent trying to unravel my neighbor's mystery, I became more and more immersed in my own thoughts and speculations. But the more I tried to find answers, the more confusing this whole maze of suspicions seemed. Finally, I decided to share my observations with my friends, hoping that they might offer a different perspective or even help me find a reasonable explanation for everything that was going on. However, the reaction was not at all what I had hoped for. Instead of support and understanding, my friends seemed skeptical. They suggested that the stress of moving and adjusting to a new life might have caused me to see problems where there really weren't any. Maybe you're just looking for excitement where there isn't any, one of them asked. All those strange noises and night walks, it could be anything, but not necessarily something sinister or suspicious. I tried to object, arguing that my observations were too specific to be brushed aside as mere coincidence or figments of my imagination. But the more I talked, the more they seemed convinced that I was exaggerating. Eventually, one of my friends advised me to give myself time to get used to the new place and try to befriend my neighbor instead of building a mystery out of him. After listening to them, I began to question my own conclusions. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really had let my imagination take me too far. I knew deep down that my curiosity and suspicions didn't arise from nothing. But I couldn't deny that stress and loneliness might have played a role in my perception of my neighbor. That night, lying in bed and reflecting on the conversation with my friends, I made the decision to give the neighbor a chance. Maybe I should have tried to approach the situation from a different angle, not letting fear and suspicion color my opinion of him. I decided that the next day I would try talking to him again, this time with an open mind and without preconceived expectations. However, somewhere in the back of my mind, a little voice still whispered that something was wrong here. It was a feeling I couldn't completely push away, despite my best efforts. And at the same time, I couldn't deny that a part of me still longed to uncover the mystery behind my neighbor's quiet facade. The next morning, armed with the determination and desire to understand my neighbor, I left the house with the intention of talking to him if the opportunity presented itself. My thoughts swirled around the previous evening when my friends had tried to convince me that I was fantasizing too much. Give him a chance, their words echoed in my head. So I decided to take that advice. To my surprise, the opportunity presented itself much sooner than I expected. Stepping outside, I saw my neighbor tending to his garden. He was digging in the ground, scrutinizing every plant, which seemed a strange activity for a man who until that moment had seemed so withdrawn and aloof. Gathering my will in my fist, I crossed the street and greeted him. This time, he looked up and, to my surprise, responded to the greeting, albeit with some caution in his voice. "Lovely day for garden work," I began, trying to sound as friendly and casual as possible. "Yes, indeed," he replied before leaning back into his plants again. I didn't know how to continue the conversation, and for a moment, I felt foolish standing there without a purpose. But then I decided to ask him a direct question. "Have you noticed anything strange in our neighborhood? I mean, night noises or anything like that?" He froze for a moment, then slowly stood up and looked at me intently. His gaze was hard, and I felt uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "Oddities. They're always there if you pay attention to them," he said slowly. "But maybe it's best to just leave them alone sometimes." His answer was cryptic and gave me no concrete answers, but I sensed a note of caution in his voice. Not knowing what else to say, I thanked him for the conversation and wished him a good day before slowly walking away. Walking back home, I reflected on our brief interaction. His words and look left me with more questions. What did he mean about the oddities? And why did he suggest leaving them alone? This conversation had only increased my desire to learn more, but now I realized that my goal wasn't just to satisfy my curiosity. I wanted to understand what my neighbor was hiding, and whether there was genuine concern or an underlying threat in his words. The unexpected interaction with my neighbor left me with a lot of questions and a strange sense of uncertainty. His words echoed in my head, spurring me to action. I decided it was time to act more decisively to solve the mystery that seemed to envelop him and his home. The first thing I decided to do was to talk to others in our neighborhood. Maybe they knew something that might shed some light on my suspicions. My conversations, however, yielded no concrete results. Most of the neighbors only gave evasive answers to my questions about the oddities in my neighbor's behavior, and some didn't even seem knowledgeable about who he was. "Oh, that quiet guy. I don't know. Nothing special," they said. It got me thinking about how well we know those who live near us. Not getting the answers I wanted, I decided to do my own investigation. The internet became my main tool. I started by searching for information about my neighbor, trying to find any mention of him or his family. I searched everything from social media to news archives. It was a time-consuming process, as information was scarce, and most of what I found had nothing to do with my case. However, my persistence paid off when I came across an old article in the local newspaper. It talked about an accident that had happened a few years ago, involving a resident of the very house that now belonged to my neighbor. Details were scarce, but it mentioned that, after the incident, the family moved away, and the house stood empty for a long time until the current owner bought it. This revelation got me thinking, what kind of accident could have happened in that house? And what did it have to do with my neighbor? My musings led me to the decision to visit the local library to try to find more information. In the newspaper archives, I hoped to find more details about the past of the house and its occupants. My search at the library proved productive. I found several articles about the house that confirmed my suspicions that strange and perhaps even tragic events had occurred there in the past. However, the connection between these events and my neighbor was still unclear. When I returned home, I felt overwhelmed with information, but at the same time even more determined to solve the mystery. I realized that I would need to continue my research and perhaps go to bolder lengths to get to the truth. But at what cost? And was I prepared to face what I might discover? Over the next few days, I barely saw my neighbor, which only increased my desire to learn more about him and what lurked behind the walls of his home. My research at the library and on the internet gave me some insight into the house's past, but I realized that I would need to do something more drastic to fully understand the situation. One night, as the moon illuminated the street with enough light to see the road but not enough to make out details, I heard strange noises coming from my neighbor's house. It was something more than the usual noises of the night. The sounds seemed similar to moaning and scraping. They were indistinct, but loud enough to get my attention. Deciding that this was my opportunity to learn more, I put on my dark clothes and left the house. My goal was simple: to get as close to my neighbor's house as possible and try to figure out what was going on inside. I carefully crossed the street, trying not to make too much noise, and approached his house. As soon as I was close, I noticed that one of the windows on the first floor was ajar. There was light coming through the crack, and I decided to take this chance to peek out. Creeping closer, I carefully lifted my head, trying not to make eye contact in case someone was inside. What I saw made my heart quicken. In a room lit only by the dim light of a lamp. There were strange figures, like scarecrows or mannequins, dressed in colorful clothes. But that was not the strange part. My gaze fell on my neighbor, who was standing among these figures, having a quiet conversation with them. I couldn't hear the words, but from his gestures and facial expressions, it seemed as if he was acting, as if these figures were living beings. I stood against the wall below the window, unable to look away from what I was seeing. My curiosity mingled with horror and incomprehension. Questions swirled in my head. What are these figures? Why is my neighbor behaving this way? What is even going on here? Before I could come up with answers to these questions, the sounds from inside the house suddenly stopped. Realizing that I could be seen, I quickly backed away, trying not to make too much noise. Once back in my house, I closed the door behind me and slumped into a chair, trying to digest what I had seen. That night changed everything. I now knew that my neighbor's secret was deeper and stranger than I had ever imagined. But what price would I have to pay for my curiosity? And was I ready to face a truth that might be beyond my comprehension? After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something forbidden, something that should have remained hidden from view. The vision of my neighbor talking to motionless figures in the semi-darkness of his living room kept me awake. I realized that my actions had crossed the line of mere curiosity, and now I was caught up in a story full of mystery and potential dangers. The next day, I tried to behave as usual, but my thoughts kept returning to what I had seen. I decided I had to proceed with caution, but at the same time, I couldn't stop my investigation. I needed more information to figure out what I was dealing with. I decided that I would try talking to my neighbor again, perhaps hinting that I knew something about his nightly activities. However, deep inside, I felt that this could be dangerous. Several days passed before I saw him on the street again. He seemed busy minding his own business, and I approached him, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Hi," I said when we got next to each other. He nodded back, but his gaze was wary. "We've been having some unusual nights lately, haven't we?" I began uncertainly, trying to understand his reaction. His gaze darkened for a moment, and then he slowly replied, "Yes, the nights are full of surprises. Some of them are better left unsolved." His answer made me freeze. It was as if he knew what I had seen and was warning me. Not knowing what else to say, I just nodded and hurried away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The more I thought about my neighbor's words, the more convinced I became that I needed to see and learn more. I decided that I would go even further. I would try to break into his house when he was away. It was reckless, but my desire to uncover the secret outweighed my fear and doubt. The next day, armed with a flashlight and some burglary tools I found in my garage, I prepared for a nighttime trek. My goal was clear: to get inside my neighbor's house and find evidence of his strange activities. As night fell, I cautiously stepped out of my house and crossed the street. My heart was racing as I approached the back door of his house. Using lockpicks, I was able to open the lock and quietly stepped inside. Silence enveloped the house, but my inner tension only increased with each step. I headed towards the living room where I had seen the strange figures earlier. When I entered the room, my worst fears were confirmed. What I saw there turned my understanding of reality upside down and made me question myself. How far was I willing to go to uncover the whole truth? Liam's heart raced as he stood on the threshold of the living room, staring into the darkness. Turning on his flashlight, He illuminated the room and saw a scene before him that made him freeze with horror and bewilderment. In the center of the room stood a table set with various antiques and old books. Around the table were arranged the very figures that Liam had seen at night. But now, in the light of the flashlight, he could see them more closely. They were not mannequins, as he had originally thought, but complex mechanical devices created with extraordinary detail and precision. Each figure was dressed in clothing from a different era, and their faces expressed a wide range of emotions. In the corner of the room, Liam noticed a large cabinet with its doors ajar. Inside the cabinet were photographs, letters, and various personal items that Liam thought belonged to a neighbor and his family. Among these items, he found an old photograph that showed his neighbor surrounded by people similar to the ones he had seen in the room, only alive. At the bottom of the photo was the date and the caption, "My family, that is no more." Liam felt a mixture of sadness and shock, realizing he had witnessed his neighbor's personal tragedy. All these figures were nothing more than an attempt to recreate loved ones who had passed away, mechanical copies that could remind him of a former life. Suddenly, Liam heard a noise behind him. Turning around, he saw his neighbor standing in the doorway with a shocked and concerned expression on his face. "What are you doing here?" the neighbor asked in a voice full of bitterness and reproach. Liam realized that his intrusion and curiosity had hurt. He started to apologize, trying to explain his actions, but words seemed insufficient to express everything he felt at that moment. The neighbor listened in silence and then, to Liam's surprise, began to tell his story. He talked about losing his family in an accident many years ago and how he was overcome with longing and loneliness. Creating mechanical replicas was his way of keeping the memory of his loved ones alive, even though he realized it was only an illusion. After this conversation, some semblance of understanding had developed between Liam and his roommate. Liam realized that sometimes mysteries were better left unsolved, and curiosity wasn't always a virtue. He promised his neighbor to keep his secret and try to help him if he ever needed it. Walking back home, Liam reflected on what had happened. He realized that each person carried their own story and tragedies, and sometimes the best way to help was to just be there and willing to listen. After his frank conversation with his neighbor, Liam felt mixed feelings. On the one hand, he was glad that he was able to understand and accept his neighbor's story, seeing him not just as a mysterious loner, but as someone who had experienced a huge personal tragedy. On the other hand, Liam couldn't shake the guilt he felt for his intrusion and curiosity that had brought pain to another person. Over the next few weeks, Liam and his neighbor began to communicate more often. Liam tried to help his neighbor around the house and garden in an effort to redeem himself in some way. However, despite their growing understanding, Liam couldn't quite escape the feeling that there was still an invisible wall between them, created by his actions. One evening, when Liam wandered over to his neighbor's house to help him repair the old roof on the barn, they broached the subject of the past again. The neighbor seemed more willing to share than ever before. "You know, after everything that happened, I thought I'd never be able to really connect with anyone again," the neighbor began, hitting a nail with a hammer. "But you showed me that even after deep wounds, there's room for forgiveness and new beginnings." Liam listened, feeling his own prejudices and fears begin to dissipate. He realized that their unexpected friendship had given both of them not only a chance to come to terms with the past, but also a chance to look to the future with renewed hope. "I'm grateful for your understanding and patience," Liam said, setting aside his tools. "I'll never forget that night. But now I see that sometimes out of darkness, light can be born." His neighbor nodded, recognition reflected in his eyes. They both realized that the ordeal they had been through had brought them closer together, allowing them a new perspective on many things in life. Those few months had changed both men's lives. Liam had learned to appreciate the depth of human relationships and realized that sometimes the truth could be stranger and more complex than any fiction. And his neighbor found in Liam a friend who helped him cope with his loss and find peace. As Liam drove home that night, he looked back at his neighbor's house, lit by the soft light from the windows. He smiled, realizing that the present confrontation wasn't with the secrets of the past, but with the ability to accept and forgive himself and others. And perhaps that is where the greatest mystery of life lies. At the dawn of a new day, Liam met his neighbor in the garden that was now a symbol of their renewed friendship and understanding. They decided to plant a tree as a sign of the new beginning they had found after all their trials, choosing a spot where the sunlight particularly brightened the plot. Together they dug a hole and planted the young tree. This act was a reminder to them that life goes on despite all the losses and hardships. As the tree took root in the ground, Liam and his neighbor talked about the future. The neighbor shared his plans to connect with distant relatives he had long since lost sight of. Liam, in turn, shared his hopes and dreams that he had long put off for a long time. This conversation was another step for them to heal and accept the past. In the months and years that followed, the tree in the garden grew and grew stronger, witnessing many changes in both men's lives. Liam found a new hobby, gardening, which helped him find peace and joy in the simple things. The neighbor, in turn, was able to reconnect with some of his family members, making his home filled with laughter and life once again. But the most important change occurred within Liam. He realized that friendship and compassion can overcome any obstacle and break down the walls that people build around their hearts. This realization was a real eye-opener for him that changed the way he looked at the world. Liam also realized that every person carries a story full of secrets and unsolved pages. But not all secrets need to be revealed, and some of them are better left behind the scenes of life, allowing people to live and enjoy each new day. The story of Liam and his neighbor was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the soul, you can find light, if only you give others and yourself a chance. It was a story of forgiveness, understanding, and the unexpected twists of fate that sometimes lead to the most extraordinary and warm human relationships. As Liam took one last look back at the house of his neighbor, now friend, he saw that the light in the windows seemed warmer and more welcoming than ever. And he realized that the house that had once seemed mysterious and frightening to him was now full of life and warmth.